so much for joining us. This is going to be a very, very conversational, interactive session. I will try and make people a bit uncomfortable and try and get people speaking and talking. We have an hour, so what we will do is I'll introduce the panelists. We'll talk a bit about just thinking beyond restitution, and then we will also invite comments from the audience as well. But like I said, it's a very, very interactive session. My name is Wale Lawal, and I'll just go ahead and introduce the panelists here with me tonight. So thank you guys all for joining. So I'll start with Dr. Oluwatoyin Shokbeson, who is an architect, cultural historian, art and heritage specialist, and museologist. She is the founder of Asha Heritage Africa and holds a master's in arts and heritage management from the London Metropolitan University and a doctorate in culture, policy and management from City University London. She is a member of the International Council of Museums and the International Council of Monuments and Sites. She has over 2 decades of experience that spans the built environment, art and heritage sector, enabling her to interrogate culture and identity from a wider perspective. She is a consultant for the European Union Institute for Culture on museums, and she is particular about the proper understanding of meanings and interpretations of African artifacts from the African standpoint. She focuses on making museums inclusive and democratic through various platforms that encourage inclusion, participation, and decolonization. Dr. Shokbeson, thank you so much for joining us. And then we also have Sarfadin Bello, who is a design architect, researcher, and creative based in Lagos, Nigeria. He holds a degree in architecture from Ivanovo State Polytechnic University in Russia. In 2016, he won the Ships and Ports Essay Competition. He was shortlisted for the Ken Saro-Wiwa Book Review Prize at the Lagos Book and Arts Festival in 2019 and placed second in the How Can We Obey the Law Against War Essay Competition in 2020. He participated in the remote research residency Memory and Memoricide of Land, Reimagining Alternative Models of Museums, cooperated by Ko-Iki, based in Japan, and supported by KOFICE, or KOFICE, based in South Korea, in 2021 as part of the project The Great Museum. And he received the G.A.S. Foundation Fellowship Award in 2022. As part of his residency, he conducted research into techno-heritage and archives and curated an exhibition titled Artifacts Reconnecting, Can You Sense Them? Currently, his practice explores the notion of access in relation to the discourse around decolonization, restitution, and the repatriation of cultural artifacts. He has interests in archival materials and the Pan-Africanist movement. His medium of expression is through text, essays, research, design, and installations. And his areas of interest operate within the overlapping boundaries of architecture, urban design, food systems, theater, culture, social inclusion, as well as public realm participation. His writings and contributions can be found in African Union Echo Digital Magazine, Lagos Development and Vision Lab, the Great Museum website. Currently, he is co-creating and working on a cross-cultural digital exchange and research residency project between Nigerian and Dutch artists scheduled to take place in 2023. So thank you so much, Sarfadin, for joining us. And then we also have Olorunfemi Johnson, who is a director and producer with interests in film, visual art, and technology. In film, he has worked with the European Union Institute for Culture, as well as Google Arts and Culture. He has worked under NGFX to produce films for Abbey Road Studios, Montclair, Lil Sims, and ID Magazine, among others. His featurette debut, The Nightmare on Broad Street, has also gone to screen in many places around the world. He was also awarded fellowship at the Basel House of Film in Switzerland, or the Basel House of Film in Switzerland. In visual art, he was awarded a fellowship at the G.A.S. Foundation. He has shown at FMB Arts Joburg and a few other local cultural bodies. He has lectured at the HFBK Hamburg on planetary thinking, computation, and its relation to art. In technology, he has been trained by Factum Foundation, a leading institution which has digitized important historic and cultural artifacts around the world. In 2020, he tutored for Binance on the significance of blockchain technology and Web3. Now, he works at the Edo Museum of West African Art as a digital heritage specialist, where he is involved in a project on digitization regarding African artifacts, currently bronzes from Benin. In that light, he has also been working with the RJM Museum in Cone, the Pitts Rivers Museum in Oxford, Cambridge Museum, and the British Museum. So thank you so much, Olufemi, for joining us. All right. And so what I'd like to do is just something really, really quickly. This is a very, very controversial question, so brace yourselves. But it's a question I love asking whenever we discuss restitution. So like, Dr. Marriott had mentioned, we did a special issue last year looking at the restitution movement. And I think what has always interested me about the restitution movement is that it's so focused on Western viewpoints. It's so focused on the Western worldview. There's so much that's been going on. And for years, in fact, decades, centuries, Africans have been requesting their artifacts, have been requesting their heritage. But I think over the years, we've kind of just condensed this debate and this argument into, oh, we can't return it because they're not ready to have them, or, oh, we can't return it because we don't know where these artifacts are from. But what I think is more interesting is asking Africans themselves what they think about the restitution movement, because from my experience, you hear some really, really interesting things, some very innovative, some very wild. But I think it all just contributes to this very, very important debate, very important side to the debate that we're not really seeing. So what I'd like to do is just really, really quickly, how many of us think they should not be returned to African museums, or they should not be returned to Nigerian museums? Show of hands. Don't worry, you're not going to be arrested. It's a safe space. It's all part of the debate. So I think this is what makes the conversation very interesting. So anyone, show of hands. I know some people might be shy about this point, but I did say it's a controversial thing. Oh, some of us are in the middle. All right, that's the third dimension. All right, who's in the middle? Who's in the middle? I feel like it's a very diplomatic place to be in. You're in the middle as well. Okay, so I'm seeing some hands. I saw you, so let's hear from you.
Okay, my name is Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
Hi. I'm just going to say why not, because basically it's from here. It's just like when someone takes your plate from your house and you say, "Oh, give me back my plate." And I say, "Oh, why should I give it back to you? It's my plate. Give it back to me." So yeah, that's what I think.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Valerie. So I will come back to you.
Rem.
Hi, Rem.
Rem from Soto.
All right. Okay.
Soto Gallery. I think it's really a question of like why, the question why, especially coming from us Nigerians wanting this. Why do we want it back, right? What is the state of what we have already? If we don't care for what we have now, why do we want it back, and what will it really do for us and our national identity? I think it hasn't been answered properly, in my opinion.
And that is a valid question, so I'm hoping that we might answer that tonight. You guys, no pressure. But I wanted to come back to you. So when we thought it was just two views, you said you were on the other side. So can we hear what you think?
My name is Crystal Agizio. I'm a member of the general public, so yeah. If it's a continuum and it's like, should we bring them back, should we not bring them back, then I'm a lot closer to we should not bring them back.
Okay, why?
I think the framing of having a conversation about museums and saying, hey, should we bring them back or not? The theory of the case is that we have no identity aside from what was stolen from us, and I think that is giving yourself the lower viewpoint in a negotiation. I think that we should bring them back if we could all agree that there's still archaeology to be excavated and the quality of our current museums are relatively poor. And if we are going to move in that direction, then yes, of course we should bring them back. But if we're just bringing them back because they were taken, to me that's not like I'm for it. Yes, why not? But I don't think that we can articulately agree as to why, essentially. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone who responded. What I wanted to do was establish some context. So we can see that this thing is a very, very nuanced conversation. And we can actually see that this is where, we should be. This is the interesting part of the debate. You know, we've all been clamoring for decades, for centuries, bring back these artifacts. And then now we're seeing that traction happen. But amongst us, we still can't really place what to do and what that means. What does that restitution mean? And how do we think about restitution in a different worldview that hasn't necessarily been written extensively about and that doesn't necessarily prioritize the West? I mean, I've had conversations with people where they told me, well, we can bring them back, but don't put them in museums because museums are a Western construct. Put them in the forest, bury them under the ground. That's where they were in the first place. And some people are like, well, how do we make money? We live in a modern time. You know, museums in the West have made so much money from this thing. It's now our turn to make money. You know, how can we do that if we don't, if we don't have these things in museums, if we don't put them in places that can kind of get funded? And then, of course, there's the whole debate of, well, we don't really care about culture. Look at what's been happening with the Lojo Bar. Look at what happened with the TBS, Gates. There's all this thing that's going on, and Nigeria doesn't really take care of its own heritage. It's a very, very thriving debate, and I can assure you that this is a debate that's happening in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in Dakar, in Senegal, in many different parts of Africa simultaneously. And so before we turn to our panel, I actually wanted to do something as well. Dr. Mara told us about the Fairwin Sarr and Benedict Savoy report, right? This was a mind-blowing report that came out in 2018. When you speak to scholars, they're still debating this report because it had some really, 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 really controversial stats, like some really, 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 thought-provoking stats. How many of us, so one of the major stats actually was they put a figure on the percentage of African artifacts or African objects that are housed in Western museums. How many of us can guess? What can we guess that number? Can we guess that percentage? And I think maybe that will help you think about the side of the debate that you think that you just said that you're on. How many of us can guess that number? What do we think that number is? Just a rough figure. I'm not expecting us to get it exactly. Yeah. Upwards of 90. Okay. Let's go. We have let's put a specific number. What do you think?
I don't know, 96.
96%. Okay. Ooh, that's a lot. All right. 72%. Okay. 92. Okay. Any others? We'll take one more. Just a random figure, guys. Don't worry, you're not getting graded. Sorry? 90. Yeah, it was 90%. So they argue that 90% of African artifacts are housed in Western museums. Is that possible? Do we think that is possible? Do we think, that is a, possible figure? And you can obviously see why, for a lot of people debating this concept, scholars, academics are kind of like, how can that be possible? Do we think that is a realistic figure? That was the number they came up with. Do we think it's a realistic figure?
The answer is simple. I think what is displayed in the museums is very different from what is in storage, which is the same length and breadth of what we have in Nigeria. So a fraction of what we have in our own storage facilities is what is shown. And I guess with new curatorial ideas, bring out new artifacts that we have in our storage. And so I think they're probably speaking about what they're seeing, which is a fragment of what they even have in storage. And it's the same thing here. We had over 90, I believe, in the documentary that was shown museums. And so for everything that you're seeing on the grounds of the museum, there's a lot more in storage.
Absolutely. Sorry, can you introduce yourself? I forgot to ask.
My name is Olufisayo Bakare.
All right, thank you. She's one of our panelists tonight. But exactly, and I think what she's also saying ties into the way that I think about artifacts as well. It's an evolving definition, right? What is an artifact? When do we have the cutoff line? How can we decide that, 90% of African heritage and African artifacts are housed in Western museums? Are people not producing artifacts today? Do we know, is there a cutoff point in terms of time? And I wanted to establish that context because what we define and what we call an artifact is always in flux. When we spoke to Chika Okeleagulu, who is a professor at Princeton, he helped us to understand that African artifacts, it's very difficult to decide where to place them because there's so many varied objects and that definition is always changing. And so if the definition is always changing, if it's this very heterogeneous thing, how can we decide where to put them? It makes that decision or it makes that debate complicated, but in my way, I interpret that as it makes it very interesting. So establishing that context, I wanted to kind of talk to our panelists today. So we started off thinking about, we established two parts. Oh, should we bring them back? Should we not bring them back? And And then we saw, just even from this discussion, that there are multiple layers into that debate. There's a middle ground. Somebody spoke about thinking about from the perspective of a spectrum. There's many different ways that we can understand artifacts, which make it very difficult to necessarily decide where they should go. And so my first question, which I wanted to ask to you, Dr. Chauverson, is what does restitution mean beyond the return of looted artifacts? So we've heard from the audience that, of course, there are many sides to restitution. On the one side, we've talked about, okay, it's a return, but we've seen that that's not a satisfactory answer. A lot of people here are kind of wondering what to do or how to process or where to put these artifacts. So what does it mean when we think about the returning of looted artifacts? What should we be looking, what does it mean to look beyond that? What are the other sides of this debate that we may be missing?
It's a very interesting debate in the sense that restitution has different aspects to it, different definitions. And if we put it in context to cultures, peoples, geographical location, and then back to each artifact, then you have multitudes of definition. But I'll make it easier, and as I make it easier for myself, restitution simply means return the artifacts. That's all it is. Just return them back to where you got them from. But the artifacts are not just artifacts. They contribute to my identity and your identity. So they contribute to individual and communal identity. They contribute to individual and communal value system, regime of knowledge. When I mean regime of knowledge, each artifact tells a different story. It talks about the technicalities that were present as at the time. It talks about the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge as at the time. It talks about cultural beliefs, the belief system that a superior, or what colonialism made us feel was a superior knowledge system of power, make us feel was bad, and then it starts questioning who you are. So there was an issue of the colonized against the colonized, where the question of constructing identity said becoming questionable. Who are you? But for each of these artifacts, they tell a different story. So I'll take a simple one, for instance. If we take the bronzes from Benin, their names are not even bronzes to start with. So when you decolonize first with the naming. Then you start with the narrative. Then you start with the story. Then you go into the syntax, the knowledge, the language. And then you see that it's so much. So where does restitution really start from? Does it start from the homes, shrines that were burned, women raped, children displaced? I said, it's a big, big, big discussion that wouldn't have an end, but I'll look at it from the perspective of not apportioning blame. First, restitution has to be seen. I know of someone here in this room who will say, it's tiring, I don't want to talk about it. When you call him, he'll say, don't go restitution, look for another word. But the point is, instead of having that, restitution should be seen as that invitation to come, let us talk. Come, I want to know you. Giving a voice to the artifacts that are voiceless. If I take the Ikenga, some of us here are Igbos, it is your soul, it is your chi. You die, your Ikenga goes. There's no point in keeping my Ikenga when I'm not here. When I prosper, my Ikenga prospers. There's a lot you can learn from an Ikenga. Same as a lot you can learn from Orisha Ibeji. It's not only an Ibeji that has the Ere Ibeji. I could have an Ere Ibeji if you go into the indigenous knowledge. So restitution helps us to unpack. It helps us to recontextualize. It helps us to ask those difficult questions, those painful memories, those challenging situations that you don't want to talk about. It's calling you to the table to say, let's have a conversation, just a conversation. You don't have to be angry about it. There are parts of it that you'll be angry about. But the point is, because we've said it's not about apportioning blame, it's my turn to tell you who I am, that my name is Oluwatoyin, and not Toyin, or not Ship. You get what I mean? Like, this is who I am, and I'm proud to be this. And I can come to the table and bring my own knowledge system to the table. If I take the Yoruba culture, the knowledge system with the Yoruba culture is not the same as the West. So I sit with my grandmother. You literally learn. You do is look and learn. You do it the way it is done. And it's not the same way. It's not a formal written code.
So Dr. Shoba, so I wanted to of course, these are all very much, and these are all very, very important perspectives to have. So what I also want to do is just make sure that we're not just maybe thinking about it from more of like only the philosophical side of things. I think a lot of us here come from different backgrounds. I'm also recognizing the fact that we have people who work within museums or people who are cultural practitioners and also have to think about this on a very, very practical level as well. So on the practical side of things, I think one of the things that's very interesting to me is that on the practical side of things, we can even see that restitution is also still a bit more complicated than just returning artifacts. I think from some examples, we've seen, for example, that some museums will return some artifacts and then, or they will simply change the ownership rights of those artifacts while keeping them within those museums. And so in this part of the conversation, I wanted to bring in Sarafadeen. So Sarafadeen, you've done a lot of work reimagining museums. You've done a lot of work thinking about museums, both from a philosophical perspective and also from a practical perspective. So for us, I think, what does that actually mean to look beyond restitution? What does it also mean to kind of think about ways of returning these artifacts beyond maybe Western practices? I've just named two, for example, outrightly returning these artifacts. Or sometimes what I think is also quite clever is how, they keep the artifacts, but then they just say they've changed the ownership rights. Have you experienced that? What does that actually mean to change the ownership rights, but then still keep them, or to kind of put them on loan, but still have them in the West, where a lot of people, majority of people from this side of the world are still struggling to access and see directly those objects?
I'll start with the idea of having this notion of and so it's quite interesting that you asked the question. Firstly, because I used to be on the side of don't return.
We have a convert.
So I used to be on the side of don't return.
All right, tell us about that.
Then at some point, I moved over to the other side of return. And the reason why I changed sides or opinion was because if you look at restitution, the conversations around restitution, they are not conversations that just started. So obviously, Emmanuel Macron and the Savoy report kind of made it popular or gave it impetus in a way. But if you trace the history, it's something that has been in the works for a very long time. With Obas requesting regalias to be returned, even in the context of the Benin, the Queen Idia mask for Festac, the request for the return, and it's not being returned. And in a way, this scenario is it's quite interesting to me because with the Queen Idia mask not being returned, we created a replica. And this replica was something that we decided to, in a way, give credence to. And so it's just an example of a group of people coming together to give credence to something. And it being recognized as the symbol, the emblem for the Festac 77. When we try to, by virtue of the positions museums have taken in history, as institutions, buildings, bodies that displayed looted artifacts and objects. When we are reimagining the future of restitution, they also have to play a role. And the role they have to play is quite complex, to be honest. So one way I see the future of museums is it being a space for congregation, a space for conversation, and a space for healing. And looking at this, it's not just healing for the oppressed, it's also healing for the oppressors. And The reason why I say that is because by virtue of the whole conversation around restitution, it's a legacy we've inherited from people in the past. As Nigerians, as the people of Benin and other places in Nigeria, we've inherited this conversation, we've inherited this struggle to fight and get these objects back. Then also in the West, as descendants of people that committed this looting and atrocities, there's also a healing process that they have to undergo. That's the way I see it. And so the museum has to be a space that welcomes everyone to have this dialogue, to have this conversation, and to serve as a meeting point. If we're talking about the reason why it's quite important to talk about restitution, and most of the time it's the focal point is the Benin bronzes. But if we look deeply, there are also other expeditions that took place across Nigeria. And so maybe by virtue of luck, the Benin bronzes would serve as a template for other scenarios and other examples. But it's something we would have to get right. And in order for us to get it right, it's not, there's no, like other people said throughout the whole conversation, throughout the whole day, there isn't like, I don't know, how do I say it? Like an available answer.
Yeah.
So it's something we also have to do like trial and error, whether we like it or not. When we are talking about decolonizing restitution, decolonizing the conversations around restitution, we have to look at what we have right now and how do we use what we have to further the conversation on restitution. An issue I've always had is that a lot of the conversations are always taking place outside the countries where these objects were being looted. And so it's also important that we have these conversations locally. And we have these conversations funded and supported by local institutions. Because when we talk about decolonization, talk about restitution, and although I've had arguments with some people on this, and the funding and conversations are mostly from the West, then are we really decolonizing anything? It's something we need to look at. Some other people have said, well, the funding part is also part of the restitution. And so let the funds come. While it's also a point, and while I do agree with that, I also feel like we need to invest more in the conversation, and we need to fund the conversations more.
So I wanted to bring in Olorunfemi as well. So Olorunfemi, right? You're okay with me calling you? You're okay with me calling you that? Awesome. But I wanted to bring you in as well because I think this is we're kind of like at a very interesting juncture in this conversation, right? We're talking about what the ideal, restitution looks like. We know that this is a very complicated conversation. We've heard from the, from our guests here, just how varied the responses have been. We've also gotten a sense that, look, there's some sort of change that needs to happen with museums, or the fact that, the way that museums operate here have to kind of, exist maybe in a different model to what has been kind of built in the West. But I wanted to ask you a much broader question. Let's kind of, we've been looking at this or thinking about the museum or this idea of restitution as something that's happening offline, that's something that's happening in physical spaces. But I wanted to kind of push it more towards like in a digital sense, right? I think when we think of like what the ideal space looks like, what does that sound like to you? I think that you're somebody that's been combining a lot of work with whether it's museums, whether it's also technology. So I want us to kind of get a sense of where you think, you know, what you think that ideal space looks like. And I'm really, really interested in knowing, when we talk about space, not just thinking about the physical space, but also taking advantage of the fact that we now also exist in a world that is just as virtual as it is physical. So where does that restitution conversation happen in that virtual space as well?
Usually, when we think about the future or anything future related, I find that it is very essential to look at the past. If we think about what a museum is, according to Plato, the writer of the Republic, he called it the house of the muses. The muses were people who, when artists needed inspiration, they go to look, they go to pray, they go to intercede to the muses. So it was a place where people go to be inspired, essentially. I find that in recent times, how, first of all, how African artifacts are exhibited in the West, they are exhibited without context. They're just objects on the wall. And here in Africa, we sort of abide to those type of standards where our artifacts are, there's no much depth for people to absorb. I think that when we're trying to imagine museums of the future, instead of thinking about the space or how the space can be advanced, let us think about the people. Because like you were mentioning about the artifacts, if I go outside now, there's so many artifacts that have been restituted, by the way, and we don't talk about that. When I think about restitution, I like to put my mind in the position of, we have the artifacts now, now what?
Exactly.
So if I go outside now and I tell somebody on the streets, oh wow, the Queen Eoba mask is back, you'd be like, how far this bread? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean anything. And we need to be able to, now thinking about spaces, we need to be able to have spaces that inspire. We need to have spaces that call people to come in. I was blessed for, last year I lived in somewhere called the Museum Capital of the World. And then left, right, center, young and old, everybody wanted to go to the museum to just see, just to be involved. But who goes to our museums here? Who goes there for inspiration? Who goes there for research? Now, relating it to the digital, I find that in our recent times, with this technological advancement, we have seen, because the digital is a tool. It is a tool used for efficiency. It is a tool used for productivity. I find that the digital could be a tool used to disseminate information at faster speeds. Everybody here did not receive an invitation by Raven. We found it on Instagram, our emails. Information moves quick. I feel like that is something spaces of the future can leverage to disseminating information. I find that with digital innovation, not just, I'm not sure how we're framing it, because there's so much innovation happening in the digital. We could have artifacts here and now for us to examine in the virtual space. We could have the information pop up. There's so many things we could work on to disseminate knowledge in this space. So now when I think about restitution, I think that we're having so many conversations about, oh, let's bring back these artifacts, let's send them back to Nigeria, we want all our artifacts. I think it should be a conversation where we could find ways to improve our spaces to make people more interested. I find that it could be used as a nice bridge between museums of the West to try and help create this context that is missing, that was taken from us. Yes, that's what my general thoughts are.
No, absolutely, and I think that those are very, 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 interesting points. I do want to challenge, if you, a bit of that. So, Dr. Subashon said something that was quite interesting to me. She mentioned the Ikenga, for example, right, and how it exists within context, and how whenever we talk about museums or we think about museums from this Western frame, a lot of the times you find that African objects get kind of displayed, and I think you also discussed that as well, kind of lose that context. One of the things that's also quite interesting to me is to kind of look at, how many or how often we find like funeral objects being stored and being like, we're talking about whether it's like objects that people are meant to die with, that are meant to kind of like disintegrate. And then there's this big question of, when we're returning objects like that, and that's why I like thinking about artifacts in that broad sense, in the sense that there's no one artifact, there's no one, archetypal artifact. They're all different, but we kind of just lump them up into this kind of, into this kind of frame. When we then look at objects like that, these objects that were not intended to be displayed, were not intended to kind of, to be held in spaces, but were actually intended to kind of like phase out, to disintegrate, to disappear. How do we kind of, when we imagine spaces for those types of objects, to me it kind of seems like that problem where you're kind of, what's that phrase? When you meet this, when an unstoppable force meets this immovable object, exactly how do you kind of bridge those two? The fact that, artifacts are so layered, they're so diverse, and they're so within context. But oftentimes, I think what the internet thrives on sometimes is being able to apply maybe the same tools to exactly, to everything. There's, conversations around things like scale and being able to showcase these things. How do we make room, both, physically and virtually, for objects whose contexts are so different? So I think, let's say, the mainstream or archetypal artifact.
When I think about things like this, I think truly about structure, because I am a person who believes in foundation and then building on foundation. Like we saw in the documentary I was privileged to shoot, the curator of the Badagry Museum said, history has been sponged from our curriculum. When I was younger, in primary school, you were seen as uncool if you were speaking your, if I was speaking Yoruba to that end, I did not speak. People look at me weird when I wear an agbada. It goes down to the roots. I feel like we are bringing these artifacts back. That how are we supposed to know that these things are not supposed to be shown? It goes back to the foundation. If we're trying to rush so many things, we would still end up in a position like how Nigeria is today, because there's so many things that if Nigeria was left on its own to flourish, to grow, we would be in a better position than we are in now. I feel like it has to go back to the foundation, start teaching people culture, and then it would grow. It would become an easier thing to do.
Absolutely. I want to bring in our other panelists as well, because I think when we talk about technology, right, one of the very interesting conversations that technology lends to is ideas around inclusion, ideas around accessibility. Technology has this promise of being able to connect us all, being able to kind of provide access in ways that maybe we've never seen with other, but particularly digital technology, in ways that we've probably never really seen with other forms of technology. And I think alongside that conversation around inclusion and accessibility is, I think, the real politics of bringing back these objects. The fact that we know that it's not a one-way street. For example, when I speak to people, when I speak to different stakeholders around, the conversations around restitution, there's often ideas around, okay, well, this is what the government wants to do, this is what institutions want to do, this is what communities want to do, this is what royal families want to do. And oftentimes, it's not often that they're aligned. So, as someone who, or as people who have done a lot of work in this area, I was hoping that you could comment on that, in the sense that, do we find restitution as it is practiced, an inclusive discussion? Do you find that the average person is included in that conversation, or do we find that it's something that's happening among elites? Do we find that it's something that's happening maybe solely amongst governments and institutions, and maybe the traditional rulers are not being involved enough? I want us to kind of think about, or at least share maybe from our own experiences, how we've seen that politics play out, and whether there are any solutions to any maybe challenges that you've identified along the way. So Dr. Shibas, I was going to start with.
Okay. The truth is they're all not working together. Everyone has an idea of what they want. And the government needs to start listening to the people. They belong to the people. So the people need to come to the table. And I will use a simple example. I've been opportune to work with communities in Oyo and around the Shango festival. They have, from their colors, there's a reason why they use that color. And then whilst trying to digitize it, we couldn't find our hue for the red that they've chosen. And we, the researchers put here in Brazil, we were looking at it like, oh, we could use purple with more red. You know, we brought in all the variations, but we had to go back to them to say, we don't have anything that depicts what you people have showed us. Which one do you people think we should put? Because this document is actually going to UNESCO. And then they said they actually came together with their head and then picked something that was similar, but then had to do a voiceover on the choice of this color to say why, because it wasn't going with the Yoruba. They have the reason why they picked that color. So to cut it short, we need to find the communities. It's the communities that can say, the truth is, a lot of these things, putting them back in their old context, it's going to be kind of difficult because some of them have made or created new ones. Some of them have moved on. Families, agboles, some of the agboles have changed. But the point is there are those meeting points that we can have those discussions that can bring about or allow knowledge to evolve. We need to know what they were, what they meant, and where they're going to.
So there seems to be this idea that museums, beyond what we know them to be, I think you're someone who has spent a lot of time reimagining museums. There seems to be this idea that museums or cultural institutions, if we're speaking more broadly, can serve as maybe this gateway to kind of like bring these stakeholders who are not necessarily aligned together. We've just heard, for example, that they're not working together. You know, the people are not being brought into the table. So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see museums or cultural institutions more broadly serving as this gateway that can kind of bring people together and make this conversation, or even make restitution as it is happening, as this ongoing process, a more inclusive and more accessible conversation, or a more inclusive and more accessible practice?
Yes. So like I said earlier, museums have to serve as spaces for conversation and bringing people together. The fact that various institutions and the government and they are not aligned, it's a big disservice to us as a people and to, for instance, creatives. Because the way I see it is, when these objects, like most of the times now on social media, we just see this object has been returned, this object has been returned. But where are these objects going to? Are they being kept somewhere? And if they're being kept somewhere, it's not adding value. Because the process of restitution is going to take, it's been over a century. And no one can tell the future, so we don't know how long it's still going to take into the future. But it's always important for us as a people to connect to these objects that are being returned. Because at the end of the day, there's no point bringing the objects back and they are not being valued by the people. And the way I see it is, we often see the conversations around restitution is elitist. And so we need to have these conversations in order to start breaking down these barriers and for more people to come into these conversations. One way I see it is that, for instance, if we are to decolonize, just a way of decolonizing, maybe an aspect of decolonizing, is if we go back to history and look at several letters and requests that have been made. What would it look like if Nigerian artists, creatives could research on these letters, the context in which these letters were written by the Obas, the people who went as convoys, or I don't know the right word, emissaries, to try and get this object back? What would that look like? I think that would be one of the steps of trying to recontextualize the conversation of it being from us rather than from an European point of view. Also, the use of technology, as Femi said, So, for instance, like the residency that I did in Japan, I didn't go to Japan. It was an online residency. And doing my research, then it was during, I think it was still during COVID or so.
Sure.
And so I visited G.A.S. Museum online. And so that was like a way of connecting with the museum without being physically there.
Yeah.
So the digital space also creates this opportunity for people to have conversations around restitution. Right now, during the residency as well, there was the digital Benin that was being developed.
Yeah.
And right now it's online.
Yeah.
So everyone can visit digital Benin and learn more about the Benin bronzes, the restitution process. And so these are various avenues and ways in which these barriers to the conversations are being broken down. And so it's up to us to kind of reach out.
Yeah.
And that was the context in which I did the exhibition. I was like, the objects are being returned, and so we have to connect with the objects. Without connecting with the objects, then it's going to be difficult to advance museum practice. And it's quite important because museums, by virtue of their existence right now, there's a crisis on the nature of museums. And so if we say we don't want to imitate or copy the European context of museums, then we need to start creating and start doing something of our own.
So I wanted to just hold you on that point, right? Because I'm also conscious of time. I'm just trying to make sure that we get as much, out of this panel as possible. We've talked about, and I like the fact, I like where this conversation is heading, but I wanted to bring Femi in here as well, right? We've talked about the politics of bringing things back. We talked about just how varied and how, how different, how differently the different stakeholders involved in this conversation are thinking about restitution. We've seen some of that reflected in this audience as well, in this, with our guests here as well. But I wanted to talk also about, what is working, right? So from the different conversations that we've had, Dr. Soberson, you've mentioned how, you were part of a group that was collaborating with researchers in Brazil. You've just brought up digital Benin, for example, right? You've been doing some work at EMOA, for example, which, has a West African outlook. I'm very interested in how we are kind of bridging not just gaps within our context, under the subject of restitution, but also maybe how it's also connecting us as a diaspora, right? So how it's connecting researchers between Nigeria and Brazil. I think Digital Benin, for example, it's not a Nigeria, I think it's based out of the US, right? It's based out of Germany. So for example, you have researchers in Germany building this really, really powerful platform that is serving, researchers in Nigeria, that's going to be serving researchers across Africa as well. There are all these solutions that are beginning, or that we're seeing. I don't want to say that we're beginning to see, because I think that there have been solutions, but I also want us to kind of make room to discuss what is working, where we're seeing opportunities for collaboration, particularly collaboration that's bridging not just stakeholders within Nigeria, but maybe even people who are facing the same challenges or having this same conversation outside of Nigeria. So I was hoping that we could talk a bit more about that. So Femi, if you could just start us with, what you're seeing that is working. I think maybe particularly from the vantage point of, EMOA, for example, and its West African outlook, which I think, just lends to that kind of international cooperation as well.
I think the question, inherently the theme is inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's different things that I've seen in my sphere that are working, that because everybody here in this audience is more learned than the people outside.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody with this type of background has a responsibility to aid in whatever way
Mm-hmm.
to help inclusion. I find that, first of all, the J.K. Randall Museum is quite interesting
Mm-hmm.
in their execution of Yoruba culture, because, like I said, me not learning the language when I grew up,
Mm-hmm.
going there, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
gave me inspiration to try and learn. It's working. And with the Edo Museum of West African Art, I quite find that the visions, the goals for including not just people in Nigeria,
Absolutely.
but people outside to collaborate and work together. It's something that is working.
Mm-hmm.
I also see everybody here who tries to show their culture in any way.
Mm-hmm.
It helps it helps everybody
Mm-hmm.
to come together. Not only though the museums are
Mm-hmm.
helping in having this conversation. I
Mm-hmm.
find that that our art that is being exported, because there's a lot of Western attention on Nigeria from Burna Boy,
Absolutely.
Wizkid. All these things truly help bridge the gap
Mhm.
between the diaspora, because you're traveling abroad, you say you're from Nigeria,
Mhm.
somebody says Bese or something
Mhm,
like that.
mhm.
It is a thing, and we can capitalize on these things on all fronts to try and make something work.
All right. What about you two as well?
Okay. I think it's quite important because the conversations around restitution is not only in Nigeria.
Absolutely.
And so the idea of even using the restitution process as something that links us, like Maret was saying about Festac.
Mm-hmm.
The Festac was this huge celebration of black identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that it's not usually talked about
Mhm.
that much because it had a huge significance. And so if we could use restitution as a connecting point between African countries,
Mm-hmm.
such that the Benin bronzes move to South Africa and some of the artifacts from South Africa come to Nigeria and things like that. So we could foster this exchange amongst African nations. It's also important to include, it's not just about museums, because I think in redefining the future of museums, we are also inherently redefining art spaces,
Yeah.
archives, libraries, and other memory institutions. And so already, if we're looking at what is working,
Yeah.
collaboration within art spaces,
Mm-hmm.
right now it's what I see as one of the, despite the difficulty we experience in Nigeria, it's one of the major reasons or major ways in which art institutions are thriving. But it's also important to look at, so like in my research, I found that while private institutions and art spaces are thriving, then we have, like you mentioned, the issue of heritage institutions. We have materials.
You're trying to find a diplomat.
So yeah, because I visited during my research. I visited a library, and literally I could see archival materials rotting in those spaces, and so even when we're talking about restitution, we need to save some of the materials we have
Mm-hmm.
right now. Because in my conversation with the librarian, he was like, when some people are looking for materials, they have to refer to some other institutions in the UK where they have to pay some fee to get material that we once had here.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also important that we try and preserve the archival materials that we have, so that we don't we don't end up
In that
losing
case,
a lot
yeah.
of these materials. And so that's the way I see it.
So, Dr. Shoba, so I wanted to bring you in so that you could have, like, the final, the final observation before we hand it over to the, to the audience, so our guests. But it's the same question for you, right? You've been doing all of this really, really important work. You've worked with researchers from multiple countries. You've worked across, different regions with different stakeholders. What are you seeing that is working? What are some of the lessons that you're learning and that you feel like, cultural practitioners here, the different stakeholders here can also learn from?
One of the things I've seen that is working is the collaboration of the West, not just Europe, America as well, wanting to know. So Smithsonian, the National Museum of African Art, is looking to know the African names of some of their collections, and I'm going to be working on that. And the interesting thing is they've put shokoto, yeah, a kembe from an ashoke and put it as trouser. And then they want the Africans to come in and say what the African naming is. So this has gone on to objects that have restriction, gender restrictions and stuff like that. So I've continued to see the interest that knowledge is not one way, it's not one-sided. Knowledge is now a two-way street. So it's the collaboration is not just us learning from the West. The West wants also to learn.
Let me
from
also
us.
kind of push this conversation slightly, right? Because we're talking about decolonization here. And I'm a very big fan of decolonization theory. So, but I also want to kind of maybe shift maybe what some of those collaborations look like, maybe beyond the West as well, right? So are we seeing collaborations with the Middle East? Are we seeing collaborations with, you know, other countries in the global South? Are we seeing collaborations between other African countries? Let's maybe talk a bit more about that. As well.
I have seen collaboration between African countries.
Absolutely.
Like Senegal. They've done things differently. Some 2-3 years ago, you can go into our museum and go with your camera. They take it from the door. And then we brought in people, some curators from Senegal, and they were like, in our museums, we call people, we invite them to take pictures and post them, and we have people coming back home to tell us the stories of their connection. So if people don't know what you have in your storage or in your exhibition, they can talk about it, and then you can know more about it. So decolonization in the South is curators knowing that they're facilitators, they're not authorities of knowledge. So allowing people to come in and say what this thing means to them, because some of them, they're actually owners, direct family lineage to those objects or to those artifacts. So Senegal is willing to let us see what they're doing, and then we're hopeful that we'll be willing to open our storage, open our doors, and welcome them in. So between South-South, yes, those collaborations are coming up, and we're hoping that it will go on.
Femi, I saw you light up and you're nodding. I think you wanted to add something quickly before we hand over to the audience.
Regarding the connection between the Global South, I think it's quite interesting because reference talking objects actually. So last year I called somebody with a similar job description as me, working in East Africa. Her name is Chow. She works as a digital heritage specialist. And I was calling and asking about archiving and then how they're imagining African museums of the future. And she was telling me about how in their structures, they try to put the objects in places with the rituals where it was taking place, the material. And then I found that was an interesting interaction between the West and the East of Africa. 2 weeks ago, I saw that she was part of the Talking Objects Lab in Senegal. And now Talking Objects is here in Lagos, West Africa, in the G.A.S. Foundation. That's an interesting thing.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to quickly just turn it over to the audience. I guess tonight you guys have been paying attention. You've given us some really, really helpful comments that helped us frame this conversation. Do we have any questions at this time? All right, let's go.
My name is Timilei. So I understand that these artifacts are very important to us because they represent a period in our history. So it's upon their return, are there other plans for their use, apart from putting them in like these showrooms and spaces? Are there other uses for like these artifacts apart from just showing them? That's my question.
Femi will be best to answer that, but little I know from the NCMM, I've not seen any program saying or telling us what it's going to be, if it's going to be visiting or touring objects, so no, for now. So I think Femi will have a better answer to that.
I think that there are plans because there are people like us having these conversations regarding this. I've been finding a lot of times people are saying, let's get these objects back, let's get these objects back. But there's a group of people around that I've been with who have said, these objects are back, now what? So I know that there are plans. Perhaps the plans are not apparent or public, but look out.
I was just going to add that there are, existing laws and bills that have been passed that we're still waiting to hear back on. I know that this is something that a lot of people have been following. And really, we do have institutions whose jobs are to kind of make sure to prevent things like looting, to prevent things like illegal trade of artifacts. There's a particular bill right now that I think is in passing. The name skips me right now at the moment. Maybe it will come back to me before the end of the night. But I think there are people, civic society people, cultural institutions, organizations, who are not just thinking about restitution as kind of like this, again, philosophical thing, but also trying to just translate that into actual practical laws that can govern. I think the general use of national heritage or artifacts, I think one thing that we've established on this panel is that it's not just an artifacts conversation. I think the fright and the anxieties that a lot of people have are reflective of the general attitude that we've seen towards national heritage objects or national heritage just in general as well. Do we have any other questions?
My name is Tolu Ami Williams. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. So my question is, there's so much going on, in terms of preparing for the arrival of these artifacts. But I see mostly conversations going on and construction going on, which is good, But what's the plan for reaching the masses? Let me borrow Femi's language. I'm of the opinion that you don't start teaching about them only when the artifacts arrive. I think you start talking about it, but I don't mean talking in the sense of sitting down and having discussions, but I mean, educating people about these artifacts. Let's start learning about them. History, like Femi said, has been sponged out of the syllabus. They're not teaching about this stuff. Kids don't go to the museums. I feel like there's so much we can do, to prepare for the arrival of these materials. Let's know them before we even see them. So when we see them, we can connect the dots in our mind. So are there conversations around integrating learning experiences and opportunities for kids or younger people, even artists, because we know about Pablo Picasso and Leonardo da Vinci and the likes, but we don't know about our own indigenous artists. They're not teaching about them. They're not teaching history in the way that we can relate with it. So what's the plan, to start learning about these artifacts even before they arrive?
These are tough questions, but, and I hate to put you on the spot again. I know this is an area of work that you've been doing when it comes to inclusion and making these things accessible. I know that it's a very broad question, so maybe what we can do is really translate that and maybe, I know that she's asked, I'll just pick that apart. I think the main question there is, how are we preparing to integrate these artifacts into societies? And I think we might be interested to know the ways in which, and I really, really like that angle, how we're thinking about it from like students, from schools, kids. And I think even just maybe speaking from your general experience, even if it's not something that we're doing today, what have you seen being done that was something that you never know who's in the room, so I could be learning from it?
Yeah, thank you. That was really, really spot on. One museum that has really started working on things like this is the MSC Shillong, because they work with schools and they have some of these objects. So the Benin bronzes or the collections from Benin bronzes are the iconic ones. There's so many things, and different museums have these objects, and they've started, for Yemisi Museum, I know they bring in the children and schools do come in and talk, and then they tend to see them. Hopefully, maybe there'll be copies where they will be hands-on, and then the children can kind of have a first-hand experience and story around them. NGOs are also having talks because they can get to the communities to let the communities know that these things are returning. We're only waiting for the government to be able to say this is when they're going to be touring, because everyone won't be going to Benin to see them. And it's not everyone on the street that have the iPhone or the phones where they could view them online. But at least if they could join in that conversation through people like you, your friends, it's touch one, touch all. So it's from me and you, basically.
Sorry, if I may add also, I think because restitution conversation, it's such a heavy conversation, such loaded with trauma, loaded with history, loaded with violence and things like that. It's a topic, unless you go looking for it, unless you go about researching it, it's not something you're just scrolling and you come across and things like that easily. And so, like, as artists and creatives, we have a responsibility to kind of get involved with the issue, the conversation around restitution. like I was saying, the digital Benin, it's online. So for artists and creatives, it's much easier because we're in tune with the conversation to go about researching about them and go about looking for information about it. For the common man on the streets, it's obviously much more difficult. And so it's only through conversations with us, creatives, that they get to know about it. And because of the nature of the, the society we find ourselves, um, museums also have to, in a way, include the economic aspects of the societies we find ourselves. And so the economics of things, the creating opportunities for people and things like that is also quite important in terms of the roles that museums will serve moving on into the future. And so it's also like when we talk about decolonizing restitution, it's also a call for artists, creatives, designers to create work around this topic in such a way that the masses are able to digest such a conversation.
Femi, did you want to add something or?
I like to throw this always back to anybody asking. In the documentary, there was ending credits. It says, "What are you doing to help showcase culture?" Because it is the job of every single person. Marriott actually, Dr. Marriott, actually described it quite aptly when he said it's like a blood transfusion. Like all of us here should spread it out into the masses because it's our responsibility.
I really think the conversation around accessibility, around awareness, sensitization is so important because I think it gets missed. I think a lot of people tend to assume because it's an important topic, it automatically gains currency among the public. So I'll tell you from our own experience. So when we kind of did our issue on the Benin Bronzes last year, I think the big question that we had was, look, how can we make this topic that is so important also interesting? I mean, we're all young on our team. About what the oldest person on the team is about 32. So it's, you have a bunch of people who are kind of like obviously nerds about this stuff and really interested in it. But we know that our audience has told us time and time again that, guys, sometimes, meet us at that level of make this thing very interesting. One of the ways that we tried to do that, which I think actually quite worked, was we did like this really experimental, which Benin bronze are you based on your zodiac sign? And then we got so many emails, we got so many messages, people telling us that, oh, wow, there's no way I would have remembered the name of this Benin bronze or known about it if you hadn't paired it, with this thing or that thing. And I think the reason I share this is because there are different ways in which people are trying to sensitize and create awareness. But I think the struggle or the challenge that a lot of people are having, and maybe it's a useful lesson for, different stakeholders, is that I think we often overestimate the ability of such an important topic to resonate with everybody. I know that it's everybody's job, it's everybody's duty, but just as you said at the beginning, sometimes you tell people about the bronze and they're like, well, what about bread? What about the currency situation that's happening? And so I think there's this, at least I'm speaking from a media perspective, right? We have this kind of like imperative to make sure that it's not just important, it's also interesting. But there are governing institutions. I think the name of the body I was trying to remember, it's such an obvious name, but it's the National Commission of Museums and Monuments. And they have literally been trying to pass a law that will kind of like increase, I guess, how much power they have and how much visibility they have into what is happening with artifacts, what is happening with monuments. It's still kind of in the process, as you can imagine, with a lot of bills in Nigeria. But I think that is a very, very solid start. And that's somewhere that we also kind of like need to be paying a lot more attention to. We've had feedback from readers who tell us, why are you guys paying attention to this thing? There's so much happening in Nigeria. But I think as one of the authors that we featured wrote, this restitution topic is not just a topic about returning objects. It's also about restoring, in many ways, like the soul of this continent. But I think there's a kind of bridge or a gap in which we now have to figure out how to translate the importance of this thing and how it really reflects not just the objects, but just generally how we're taking care of our own societies, how we're building livable cities. There's different pockets of society, and I think the big question is how we translate that into those different pockets. I think that's kind of what will make the difference. But it is happening. It is happening. it's maybe just taking its time to get to you, but it will, it is happening. I wanted to take, maybe the final round of questions. Okay, yeah. Okay, awesome.
So I just wanted to know, like, in a perfect world, how would like the business world or the corporate world contribute to the efforts of repatriation? Or how, yeah, like, or I guess like would you envision for something like that?
One beautiful way is invite them to the table and let them adopt one or two of these artifacts and start to pay for its maintenance, conservation, and stuff. So it's actually inviting them to the table for them to know the artifacts represent them as well. Yeah. And they have a CRS, they have a responsibility towards it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That was quick.
Femi, you're nodding. Did you want to say something? All right. So I will say, so I have a corporate background, and I'll just say, like, look, when we look at the creative sector, right, there are many ways in which, business people can play roles. One of the things that we've discussed many times with different people who are involved in thinking about restitution and thinking about cultural heritage is the fact that, how are we making this movement sustainable? And what is it that makes it sustainable? It's financing. It's thinking about the different innovative ways that you can really inject capital into this movement or into even just the cultural landscape in general. We've talked a lot about returning objects, but I also like to think about it as an opportunity for exchanges in the sense of you're not just returning objects, but you're going to train the people in those museums that are going to deal with these objects. You're going to set up programs that are going to enable people who are studying art, who are, within that space, being able to travel abroad. You think of how you're going to sort out the visas, but you're going to think about how you're going to do that and make sure that these people are building skills, and not just, skills within the areas of, taking care of the objects, but also how to kind of make them financially sustainable, how to build models that allow your museums to actually thrive. We live in an environment where cultural institutions rise and fall like in the same frequency. So nothing ends up really moving. And I think really what corporate people are in a position to do is they have capital. They can literally put their weight behind this movement in a way that is sustainable, working together, with existing actors to make this thing work. I don't think it can work if you don't have that injection of capital. And I don't think it's also something that's really expensive. I think the real question is just how to make it long-term and how to bring it back, how to bring it back to the continent. In an ideal world, though, I don't just see us collecting these objects from people. I also like the reparations conversation. I don't think of it as a financial, injection of just give us some money. No, but I think of it as a continuous process, how you're building the human capital of the people that, have lost these objects in the first place and now have to receive them and, ensure that they actually thrive here. I think, corporates are really in a position to do that or at least support that. All right.
If I would add, then there's also the aspect of, as creatives, supporting art spaces through volunteering. Sometimes we're waiting for the big institutions and corporate institutions to do stuff. And usually, as an individual, you could reach out to an arts institution and ask them, how can you volunteer your time and your skill to help support their programming and what they do. Another aspect is maybe, so I volunteer for an institution that works with youths. And so sometime in 2019, during the Lagos Biennale, I kind of encouraged and facilitated them bringing the youths to just go around the Biennale because they hadn't visited one. And so it's also about us as individuals looking in to see what we can do in our little spaces and with the little we have. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
All right. And so we'll use that opportunity to wrap up. You guys have been fantastic. These have been some really great questions. I wanted to give our panelists just a really quick opportunity to tell people where they can find your work. You guys are amazing. I'm sure people want to keep up with you. They want to know how to find you. So if you could all just use, very briefly, tell people where they can find your work. Yeah, but they don't know the handles, so,
Okay, so you can find me on Instagram at On The Review Today. So in a different world, when I was thinking I would be a blogger or something, that was the handle I created for myself. So on the review today, yeah. So if you want to reach out, engage with me on Instagram, yeah.
All right, thank you.
EMOWAA.com, MOA.com.
You can find me on Asha Heritage Africa Foundation.org.
All right, thank you guys so much. So we've seen so much, we've learned so much, and we know that it's a thriving debate. It's continuous, and then the final thing I wanted to say is, Wale Lawal again, founder of the Republic. You will find us at republic.com.ng. We have copies of our latest issue here as well. If you're interested in the African artifacts debate, we brought that as well, and I think one of my team members is here, and you can always reach us either during the break or at the end. But thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful.